Hi there, welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I am Lucy Steigerwald, and today in the internet studio is someone I've been trying to wrangle for a while, but she's very busy, so that's not a complaint, but it is Evan Greer. I'm going to be awkward and read her bio. Evan is a transgender queer activist, singer-songwriter, parent, and organizer based in Boston. She writes and performs high-energy acoustic songs that inspire hope, build community, and incite resistance! She tours internationally as a musician and speaker. The list of people you've collaborated with, shared the stage with, is very impressive, I have to say. Pete Seeger against me, Tom Morello, Ted Leo, Amanda Palmer, Billy Bragg. Ooh, okay. But she's also currently the campaign director for Fight for the Future, the viral digital rights nonprofit behind the largest online protests in history. And she writes regularly for places including The Guardian, Time, Newsweek, HuffPost. She's been a guest on Good Morning America, All Things Considered. Has been interviewed about her music activism by places such as The New York Times, Rolling Stone, Time, Pitchfork, and even Fox News, the very last words in the bio. But thank you, welcome, and thank you for coming, Evan.
But most importantly, the non-Serviam podcast where we are right now. So let's,
The
keep that
most
in perspective.
important. I like to start a little bit with you and your political journey, if there was one. And we like to start with, if I accosted you and said, "Say, what is your political identity? How would you describe yourself? What would you say?"
Well, it depends on who you were. If you accosted me, if you were a cop and you accosted me and was like, "What is your political identity?" I would be like, "Officer, I just believe in following the law." And no, but really, I strongly identify as sort of a pragmatic anti-authoritarian. I My roots are absolutely in anarchist politics, and I really got my start in activism. I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and the U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I really cut my teeth on primarily like anti-war and anti-imperialist organizing. And I think being a young person in that particular political moment, and organizing specifically around like US empire, and then sort of recognizing how a lot of these like big peace rallies and like marching around waving signs wasn't actually stopping this machine from grinding is really what sort of radicalized me and opened my eyes up to the kind of economic and political realities that underpinned those particular acts of violence, and got me more interested in learning about how to be a strategic and effective activist, while also just getting like super immersed in kind of like anarchist subculture and punk music and all the things that go along with it. So that's all definitely been part of my journey. Now I run a nonprofit, so I'm totally like a sellout from at least what my 20-year-old self would think. But I still very much carry that spirit of seeing authoritarianism and unaccountable power as like the primary ills in the world, and seeing radical, transformative, grassroots action, direct action, and organizing as the primary tools we have to fight it.
Yeah. What got you more focused on digital rights and Fourth Amendment stuff? Like, did you have an early internet life that influenced that at all?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it is just like, I'm one of those like geriatric millennials. I, was again like a teenager in the early 2000s, late 90s, as the internet was sort of becoming a thing. Long before social media became really prevalent, I was like very frequently involved in like using indie media sites and like those kind of early versions of online organizing spaces. But really, it was also for me a little bit more personal, where I, also in high school is when I started playing music and releasing music and recording music. And this was like so long before Spotify or like anything like that. And so me and my like other kind of like anarcho folk punk friends were like recording stuff in our bedrooms and then like uploading it directly to archive.org where people could download it, and like encouraging everyone to just like share it around. And I vividly remember like the year I dropped out of college, I did my first ever tour of Europe. And I remember being in like Prague in the Czech Republic, which was like the furthest I'd ever been from home, and playing a show in this weird little anarchist record store. And there was like 100 kids there that knew all the words to every single one of my songs. And I
Wow.
was like, how does this happen? And like, that was a moment of just feeling like the liberatory power and potential of this technology. And then what I would also say is that since then, I've also seen the other end of that sword, where I've had loved ones and members of my political community targeted by surveillance. I've experienced and seen the destructive power and force of big tech and social media and platforms like Spotify that kind of prey upon um, all of our like worst instincts while profiting. And so, but the real story is that I like tried to make a living as like a touring transgender anti-capitalist folk singer for a while, and had a kid and maxed out a few credit cards and needed a quote unquote real job. And so I found Fight for the Future about a year after it had formed, which was a year after the big SOPA strike, which they had organized as the largest online protest in human history that helped strike down internet censorship or copyright legislation that could have led to widespread internet censorship. And so I kind of joined the org because I needed a job, but it actually has become really, in a lot of ways, my life's calling, where
Hmm.
I care a lot about a wide range of issues. I've always cared a lot about labor. I write a lot of like labor related songs, and, I've played on my fair share of picket lines. I've always cared a lot about the environment. I've always cared a lot about prison abolition and prison justice. I've always cared a lot about LGBTQ issues. And I don't know that I could like work on just one of those things all day, every day, because I care about all of them in the ways that they intersect. But when I think of my work of fighting around technology, and whether technology is a tool for social movements to use to fight for justice and liberation, or a weapon for authoritarians and tyrants to use to subjugate us, that feels sort of like a foundational struggle, and something that I can like focus on all day, every day, and know that it will touch all of those other things that I care about.
Um, can you tell me just a little bit about Fight for the Future as an organization? Remind me what year that big, I remember that, the SOBA thing, but I can't remember what year we're talking.
Yeah, so that was 2011,
Okay.
2011, 2012, and I joined just a little bit after that. And yeah, I mean, so Fight for the Future is, we call ourselves a collective of activists, artists, and technologists, and we work together to run kind of splashy, high impact campaigns that mobilize millions of people to fight for a world where technology is a force for justice and liberation rather than a force for tyranny and greed. That's a lot of words. What does that actually mean? It means that we mobilize college students on their campuses to get their administrations to commit to not using facial recognition surveillance on campus.
Hmm.
It means that we mobilize millions of people to fight for net neutrality protections that prevent telecom companies like Comcast and Verizon from screwing us over more than they all already do. It means that we fight for against legislation that could lead to censorship of LGBTQ and abortion content online. It means that we defend important liberatory technologies like end-to-end encryption, so ensuring that encrypted messaging apps like Signal are usable by activists and aren't backdoored by governments or banned entirely, as many governments around the world would like to see. So in practice, those are some of the types of things that we do. And, we don't do that by, we're not a think tank. We certainly do some amount of engaging with the legislative process in Washington, D.C., but we believe that our real power comes from our ability to use technology and activism and creativity to mobilize people, rather than from cozying up to or becoming friends with politicians and lobbyists and people already in power.
Yeah, because those people love to try to ban. Well, there's I feel like I have to ask you, among many other things, about Section 230, and in particular, how certain Democrats have taken like this moment under Trump to try to make the internet less free. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the misunderstanding towards Section 230, or like what, what are they doing? I mean,
Oh, I have so many thoughts. And there was actually just an episode of Democracy Now that really broke my heart because I generally like Democracy Now, and they just like totally fumbled a segment on Section 230. But
oh no. Okay.
I think that that's indicative of the fact that like there's just a we have a lot of work to do to help educate folks on the left about this issue, and part of that is because it A is really genuinely complicated, and B because big tech companies and their lobbyists have like actively obfuscated this issue over the years and sort of conflated it with their own economic interests rather than our free expression interests. But really quick, I'll try and do like the quickest like 30 seconds on an anarchist podcast about Section 230 before people's eyes glaze over.
All right.
Broadly speaking, this is the law that allows websites and apps to host our speech. Without it, people would sue websites and apps for speech that they do not like, whether that is speech about abortion or speech about guns or speech about drugs or speech about whatever. Um, in a world without Section 230, the only speech that platforms would be willing to host is speech that they are very certain will not get them sued. So, in effect, Section 230 is the thing that makes the First Amendment sort of work at the internet scale. Um, what confuses people is that Section 230 is liability protection for big corporations. And that
Mm,
sounds pretty bad, right? I
right,
don't
right.
like big corporations. I would like to be able to sue them for all kinds of things. But I think what people misunderstand is that, especially in this particular moment, Section 230 is sort of the last barricade against like Trumpist censorship really taking over the internet. And one of the really important things to understand about it, and the way I like to think about it, is that really it's like a mass decriminalization of speech. That's really
Mm,
what Section 230 is in effect. So it is the thing that means that even though Alabama and Mississippi and Texas could all pass a law that says speaking of telling someone online how to get out of state and get an abortion is illegal and it's a crime and we consider it abortion trafficking, and if you do that you're in big trouble. Section 230 is the thing that prevents that state law from being enforced against a platform like Instagram or Facebook or Blue Sky. A company like, or a project like Blue Sky, which is where a lot of folks have flocked post Elon Musk taking over Twitter, literally would not exist in a world
mhm.
without Section 230. A project like Wikipedia could not exist or survive in an environment without 230. Facebook absolutely would survive in a environment without 230 because they can afford the armies of lawyers that it would require to sort of fight it out in court. And also, they don't really care about preserving marginalized people's speech, as they've shown by bending the knee to Trump. And so,
Mhm.
really, what we get if we blow up Section 230 in this moment is we kneecap our ability to create alternative places online where people can organize. And we essentially codify and solidify the monopoly power of the largest tech companies that can afford the armies of lawyers and lobbyists to essentially shape what a post 230 environment looks like. So, we could spend easily the whole hour talking about that. But if you search my name and Section 230, there's a few pieces that I've written about this. There's one for Wired that's specifically about its impact on abortion. And there's one I wrote a while back that's specifically about listening to sex workers. I
Mhm.
think the other really big important thing for people to know about Section 230 is if you've ever heard of Sesta Fosta. Sesta Fosta was the last time that Congress changed Section 230. It was a bill that was purported to address online sex trafficking. In fact, all it ended up doing is creating widespread censorship of LGBTQ content, putting sex workers in danger, shutting down places online where sex workers were comparing notes and helping each other avoid abusive situations because platforms were worried about getting sued for allowing them to organize in that way. So you can imagine that being extrapolated out to platforms that allow people to organize anti-racist protests, platforms that allow people to criticize Elon Musk, whatever it is. This is what we have to lose if we don't preserve this foundational protection for online free expression.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about the Sesta Fosta stuff and how sex workers all pointed out exactly what it would do. And all sorts of Democrats were like, that's great. And then, 2 weeks later, after it passed, they were like, oops. And it gives me serious case of pessimism when it comes to protecting the rest of Section 230. People love ignoring sex workers, unfortunately, but like, I know you're not a lobbyist, but like, do you find that you can convince the normies and the Democrat types about this kind of thing? I mean, it's
Yeah, I mean it's definitely an uphill battle, but what I will say is like we are making some progress.
mhm.
And I do think that if ever there was a moment where Democrats could get their heads out of their butts and like kind of think a little bit more critically around this, it would be now. Like even,
Mhm.
like the Tesla takedown protests, which I think are like of a certain flavor, but also like kind of exciting in the sense that like it is something that people are gravitating toward. Like all of that is being organized on Blue Sky, and like none of that could exist in a world without 230. And like that is a message that I think will resonate with Democratic lawmakers. And we have seen like younger lawmakers, like even like AOC has come out and like said some positive things about this issue and like criticized Sesta Fosta. We've even seen like my senator, Elizabeth Warren, who I argue with about almost everything, introduced a bill called the Safe Sex Worker Study Act, which would basically study Sesta Fosta and the harm that it did. And we've been kind of pushing for, to try to create like a block of progressive Democrats to just come out and say, you know what, I'm open to talking about changes to Section 230, but we shouldn't even be talking about that until we pass this study bill to examine what happened the last time we changed Section 230 and avoid making those mistakes again. So I think, one of the things that Fight for the Future often focuses on, for better or for worse, is like stopping bad things.
Mhm.
Because frankly, it is easier to stop bad things in Washington, D.C. than it is to make good things happen. And so it is, we've been very, very good at stopping bad bills. It's kind of one of our fortes, whether we're like organizing like thousands of angry gay teenagers to call their member of Congress, or, getting like a press hit in just the right place at the right time, or crowdfunding a billboard and sticking it, right outside some lawmaker's office and telling people to call them. These are all things that we can do using, these imperfect tools that we have available to us of social media and the internet to, at the very least, hold at bay some of the most authoritarian policies. And like to me, like that's a means to an end, right? Like it's not like I think that just like protecting Section 230 brings us to like justice and liberation and we can all live in a giant vegetable garden reading anarchist poetry to each other all day. But rather, I know that the people who are out there on the front lines, fighting for the things that I believe in, like police and prison abolition, like trans liberation, like climate justice, they need these spaces and these tools. And if I can play a small role in like preserving that and kind of holding the catastrophe at bay to give them time to build their ranks, that feels like something useful that I can do in this moment.
Um, is there a difference now in, as someone who obviously isn't like yay Joe Biden, yay mainstream Democrats, now when again the sort of wine moms, or they keep saying wine moms, I don't know if that's fair or not, are mad at Trump, sort of like the, suddenly immigration matters again and the horrible things the US does to immigrants matter again. I don't think you have to be an accelerationist to feel like this terrible climate has obviously provoked a bigger backlash. I don't know if you like reevaluate the way you do anything under Trump or if it's kind of the same type of tactics.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what I would say is like, and this is just my own personal take, but the advice that I've been giving to people who kind of come to me being like, what should we be doing? Like everything is on fire.
Hmm. Yes.
Is like try to find something to focus on. Like pick one thing that matters a lot to you and like get together a group of people and try and focus on that one thing. Because, like, if we're all, I've said this morning to a friend, but like, my instinct is often to be like a moth to the flame. Like as an organizer, especially an online organizer, like you do kind of want to go where things are hot. And if people are focused on something, like, and a fire's already burning, like the instinct, metaphorically, I will say to the feds listening in, is to pour gasoline on that metaphorical fire. But when everything is on fire, you can't be a moth to the flame. You have to like pick a lane and stay in it. And so I think, and I think that that's important. And if you have like a clear guiding principle for your organizing, then you're going to keep doing it, whether Joe Biden is in the White House or whether like, Marjorie Taylor Greene is our president in 2036 or whatever the hell happens, and
Good
because I
call.
do think it's essential that, I always, and it's the thing that's been giving me like hope and inspiration in this terrible time is to just remember that like, and to take inspiration from, for example, like abolitionist activists who've just been like slogging away at this issue for years under Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, good times and bad. They have a clear North Star, a vision that they're moving toward, and they're just going to like keep moving toward that no matter what else happens. And I do think that like we can all learn a lot um, by just recognizing that like effective strategy means making tough choices. It means choosing to work on one thing and not work on another thing. But it also means not being pulled in a million directions or being like a mile wide and an inch deep. Like each of us can be most effective by picking a thing or a handful of things that we're going to focus on and really staying focused on those things and not letting people like Trump, who are masters of manipulation, kind of just like pull us in a zillion different directions every day. Now that's easier said than done, and I'm not always great at doing it, but that's my best advice for folks that are trying to figure out what the heck to do in this moment.
That is advice I need very much to take to heart. The focusing and the picking a thing. That's um, in general about the internet. You mentioned Blue Sky. I feel like now myself I am almost as overly on Blue Sky as I once was on Twitter. I don't know if Blue Sky Mastodon type things. Do you find hope in those? Like I would like the peak of the internet as a corporate walled garden. Maybe if we do this right, like it already peaked, and now we're getting back to a little more interesting things. I've seen people sort of facetiously say like let's bring back blogs, but I don't know if you have any sense of things going in that direction and whether it is a reason for optimism. I guess.
Yeah, I hope so. And I do think it is important because I also see like people raise valid critiques about Blue Sky and Mastodon themselves, right?
Yeah.
And like every tool that we have is going to be imperfect. But I do think it's important for people to get a little bit sophisticated about like how we think and talk about this stuff because Blue Sky is like fundamentally different than Twitter. Like it's not just like a Twitter clone run by someone who's less of an asshole. Can I say asshole on your podcast? I don't know.
Absolutely.
Um, okay, great. It, you know, it is more like Wikipedia in the sense
Mm.
that it is like a protocol run by a nonprofit. And if you don't like the way that the current Blue Sky moderation team is moderating, you can theoretically spin up your own version, which some people have already done. Like there's Black Sky, for example, which is a version of Blue Sky built predominantly for Black users,
Mm.
with its own moderation practices built on top of the same protocol. So like you can think of this as like social media becoming more like email, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
can have a Rise Up address or a Gmail address, and you can still email each other. Hopefully, we are getting to a place where like you can have a social media account or handle, and if you don't like the landlord you're renting from, you can move into a different apartment. And I think that that is very different, and will address like some of the real harm that we've seen coming from centralization and monopolization. But it doesn't solve everything, right? Like there can still be real, like, people will eventually have like Nazi Sky, where they
Right.
will like do crappy Nazi crap, and like that is a real problem too. And so I think we just need to like have both of our eyes open to like the liberatory potentials of these technologies and the real harm that can be done by these technologies, and just recognize like, I just think it's sort of, we get dragged into this idea of like, is the internet good, is it bad? And like, it doesn't matter, like it's here and
Yeah.
it's power, and we need to either wield that power or try to take that power away from our enemies. Like I'm much more interested in like who has the power than I am in sort of like these theoretical debates of like, is the internet more like cigarettes or more like LSD? And I'm like, I don't care. It's like power.
Yeah.
Let's figure out how to contend with the power and the way that this technology influences power relationships and power imbalances in our society.
Um, I guess what would I've heard people suggest. It could have been a Fight for the Future. I don't even remember at this point, or EFF or something. Basically, say that like the ideal internet would be, the roads are neutral, but in your own car, there you can have light moderation, no moderation, heavy moderation. I don't know if like what the correct internet, if you were um you know deciding as the overlord of the internet, what it would look like in terms of providers versus sites.
Not a lot of people know this, but I actually am the overlord of the internet. So, no, I'm just kidding.
That would be great. I mean, better than.
I don't know. I'd probably be corrupted by all the power, just like everyone else. But no, I think that's exactly right, right? And I think this is a good way to think about content moderation generally,
Mhm.
is because I think we can get a little bit into this idea of like, oh, well, like, platforms should just like take down all the bad stuff and leave up all the good stuff, which is like, okay, but like who gets to decide what's good and bad? And like, I think especially for those of us who are anarchists or come out of like a more radical left tradition and understand that like often some of the best and most important ideas have been considered very dangerous ideas for a long time, we can question that. That said, I think a good way to think of this is, and I like to throw a lot of queer dance parties, so I think of things like this, right? And it's like, if I'm throwing a queer dance party for my friends in my basement, that has like one set of rules where it's like, well, it's probably just not going to be that many rules because I know everyone there and I'm only going to invite people who are chill. If I'm throwing like a massive, like, rave dance party that's like sponsored by some grant that I got in like a 2,000 person venue, like, damn right, I'm going to be like, no, you can't bring your backpack, like, this and that. We're checking IDs at the door, like, because I don't want to, cause a huge problem or put people in danger. And so like I think just thinking about the fact that like you have different rules for like a house show versus a giant music festival,
Mhm.
and like there's a reason for that. And so I think just like the more we can allow for consent within internet spaces where like we are getting to pick and choose like what we see, who we're interacting with, rather than that being chosen for us by these surveillance capitalist corporate monopolies, the less we're going to need to depend on this kind of blunt force instrument of centralized corporate censorship as like, people tend to present it as like, either you let crazy Nazis run rampant or you let Mark Zuckerberg decide what you can and can't say. And it's
Or
like,
both, of course.
yeah, or both, right? And like neither of those are acceptable options, right? And
Mhm.
so we need to be like fighting for like I'm actually psyched too that like in some ways I think it's cool that people are going to Blue Sky. I also think it's great that like I feel like group chats are just like blowing up. Like now,
Mhm.
like everyone has like an 800-person signal group that they're in or whatever. And like that's actually great. Like not everything needs to be like Twitter where you're like broadcasting to the whole world. Like sometimes you can
Sure.
just have your like little group chat for like the other queer D&D nerds in your neighborhood, and like that serves the purpose. And so I think just like rethinking like, what is this for? What are we
Mhm.
actually using it for? What's the goal versus just like, I want attention, which, is like kind of the incentive structure that most of these social media companies have created. Um, and I think there's even like a misnomer or like a misunderstanding where like even for activists we can sort of assume that like attention translates to power, and in some ways it does, right? Like if no one knows about your issue or your protest or your thing, then like it's hard to build power.
Mhm.
But there are many examples throughout history of people who've made massive changes in the world who were not particularly focused on getting attention. and or like, had a wing of their movement that was very focused on getting attention, but then a very clear idea of what they were going to do with that attention and energy. And I think social media really incentivizes like this false idea that we can just like educate our way out of tyranny, and that like if just enough people know like what we think about this thing, then like suddenly hearts and minds will change. And I just don't believe in that. I think organizing is like a more painful, slow, slogging process, and that there isn't like a quick fix solution to that. But I do think social media can play a powerful role in it too. It's just a matter of like being real about what the limitations are and what the potential is.
Do people actually want privacy, especially since we're offered such convenience and amusement via smartphones that track us and internet that tracks us? And if they do want it, how do you make that easier? I mean, is there a way to make that kind of a default?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people absolutely do want privacy. And I think like the way that you can tease that out is by helping people think about what type of privacy they actually care the most about. I
Hmm.
think a lot of times people who are not super involved in direct action organizing and activism, who maybe are just, are kind of like, I don't care. I don't have anything to hide. Like the cops aren't kicking in my door. So, like, whatever. But then if you were like, okay, unlock your phone and hand it to your mom, they're like, oh, yeah, no, not that, because like I have all these nudes on there, or like I just texted my weed dealer, or whatever it is, right? And then suddenly people care a lot more about privacy.
Hmm.
So what I always say to folks is like, if your threat model is not the FBI, like what about your like creepy ex that's like still stalking you? What about like your boss? What about your landlord? Right? Like these are all realities.
Hmm.
And I think like the idea that like people just don't care, or like there's this false idea, especially, and I hate this, it's like, oh, the kids these days don't care about privacy because like they post everything on TikTok, right? Like there's a huge difference between like expressing yourself and choosing what you are putting out into the world, and having all of your secrets revealed, or not having any space that's different from that.
Hmm.
I think the thing that I also often say about like privacy is like privacy is not so much about like what we have to hide, it's about our ability to evolve as a human society. When we don't have privacy, if like, for example, if like the US government had ubiquitous facial recognition surveillance technology the way they do now in like the 60s, it's easy to see how the civil rights movement would not have been as successful as it was. It's easy to see how the LGBTQ rights movement and the Stonewall uprising maybe wouldn't have happened in a world where like organizers of these types of events could have been quickly tracked and arrested. And all of that like culture change that we've seen as a result of those social movements just like wouldn't be here.
Hmm.
And so I think like whether, it's more of a collective problem than an individual problem. And I think that's the other thing I often, folks often come to me and are like, hey, like what settings should I change on my phone to like be private? And like there are real concrete things that people can do. And like everyone absolutely should, at bare minimum, make sure you have a good password on your phone. Don't use Face ID or a thumbprint. Get a password manager. Don't use your dog's name or your mom's name or your birthday. Like those are like, and turn on two-factor authentication on all your accounts. Start
Hmm.
there. If you're doing that, you're already like way ahead of most people, and you're already like significantly safer than you would have been. Switch from text message to Signal. Super easy, super great. It works
Hmm.
exactly like WhatsApp. It's not owned by Facebook. Um, you know, Now you're doing three things that are like better than most, than you would have been before. But the other thing I tell people when they're like, what can I do to protect my privacy? I'm like, go yell at your senator and tell them to
Hmm.
pass a freaking privacy law. Because in the end, like, this shouldn't be something that we all have to like figure out individually. Like, resisting surveillance is a collective action and something that we do together. And like, I really, I think it's really important that folks don't get defeatist about it. Like
Hmm.
there have actually been some really significant privacy wins in the last couple years. I think arguably the biggest one, weirdly, was actually at Meta, which is that like we pushed really, really hard for them to encrypt Facebook messages by
Hmm.
default. And now Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger, and WhatsApp are all end-to-end encrypted by default.
Oh.
And like that is something that like overnight took like billions of messages and made them way, 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 way harder for the government to surveil. You know, do I trust Facebook and Meta? No. Do I trust open source end-to-end encryption? Yes. Yes, I do.
Mhm.
And so I think just like recognizing that like there are ways, like technology is about choices, and like we've made certain choices in how technology is built, and we can make different choices. And if we don't like the choices that corporations or governments are making for us, we can try to scare the hell out of them until they change those choices. And we've actually had some success at that in the past, and can and should keep doing that in the future.
Yeah, I think I'm still actually just catching up to the idea that it seems like when a bunch of people call their congressperson, they actually pay attention to some extent because they're like, oh, someone is actually looking at what I'm doing. So I know that's really basic shit, but yeah, I should remember that myself probably.
Well, and I think it's like good, you know, again, like I think especially for those of us that see ourselves as more radical or more like we don't really believe that that like representative democracy or like this particular legislative system is going to bring us the type of liberation that we want. There can be a tendency to then like totally disengage from it.
Hmm.
And like, you know, emotionally, like I think that's really valid. Like I know way more about the legislative process than I ever wanted to. um, but I also think it's important, again, like effective and strategic organizing is about like division of labor and like everyone kind of having a role. And I think some of us that have a more radical critique kind of need to like know how the sausage is made, and know how the machine works so that we know what the weak points in it are, so that we know where we can like, you know, slow down different parts of the machine or throw sand in the gears. And so, you know, and in the end, that's like largely a harm reduction tactic. But I also see it as sort of like catastrophe aversion.
Hmm.
Because, for example, if governments succeed in banning a tool like Signal or end to end encryption, that could prevent like the Zapatistas of the future or the Black Liberation Army of the future or whatever the next like revolutionary social movement that has a real shot at transforming society. Like they could all be in jail before they even have a chance to get off the ground if they don't have access to private communications. And so like these are all kind of like foundational issues that I think are worth fighting for, even in these deeply broken and imperfect ways, like engaging with the legislative system.
Hmm. Um, is there a single legislation or decision that could make a really substantial difference? For example, my techish husband is a big fan of getting rid of the third party doctrine and feels like that would make a. But like again with the magic wand, is there like one thing either abolishing or adding that would make a big difference?
Gosh, I mean, there's a lot. I think,
Hmm.
you know, in terms of like on the defensive side, I think stopping this constellation of sort of like unholy bipartisan censorship bills that are often framed as like kids safety or preventing
Yeah.
online sales of fentanyl, or we're just going to verify everyone's ages to make sure that they're old enough to look at porn, and oh by the way, that means that you're uploading your government ID every time that you do anything online. You know, preventing that is, I would argue, probably the biggest and most important thing on the legislative front that we can do right now. In the future, if things change politically, I don't think there's really any opportunity for this in the short term, at least at the federal level. But I
Hmm.
do think there's ground that can be gained at the local level. I think it's largely around cracking down on corporate and government surveillance. So during the last Trump administration, we actually did have some success. We got, I think, around a dozen cities in the US to ban their police from using facial recognition
I was
surveillance.
going to ask about actually just that.
And like that, you know, does that stop all bad things that police do? No. Does that stop like every type of surveillance that police use? No. But does that significantly limit one of the worst types of surveillance that could kind of bring about like the type of totalitarian enforcement that a Trump administration would like to see? Yeah, it's pretty important and it's good. We're fighting for, I live in Massachusetts. There's a bill moving here that would ban the collection and sale of cell phone location data.
Mhm.
That's like a real reduction of surveillance surface area that actually does make a difference. And so I think just, what I often do is, again, like I identify as an abolitionist. And it's funny if you're an abolitionist to like engage with these, you know, bills that are sort of inherently reformist, right?
Mhm.
But what I do is I ask myself, like, if is this bill going to uphold and strengthen the system that I want to tear down, or does this bill kind of chip away at its foundation? Right. And so I think like you can run that analysis on a piece of legislation. And for my, so if a bill just says like, yeah, you can use facial recognition as long as you like get a warrant and like test your facial recognition system and make sure it works pretty well, that's reformist, right? Because
Mhm.
that actually encourages the adoption of this type of technology and sort of gives the government a way to be like, well, yeah, but our facial recognition is like complying with the law. It's all good. Whereas if a bill is just like, you cannot use facial recognition surveillance for any purpose, that's sort of like an abolitionist law that's like
Mhm.
cutting away at this technology and creating more space for our social movements to fight for the type of world that we want to live in. So that's kind of the internal rubric or analysis that I use when thinking about legislation and whether or not we should be supporting it or ignoring it and letting others perhaps do that fight.
That's a good metric, I think. More depressing stuff. I guess I don't know if you specifically. I don't know if I want horrible stuff against trans people lately. As a cis person, for example, I don't know if what should I be doing, since people apparently need advice from you on how they should be activists. But like, what should all the cis be doing?
Cis people, you should all, I don't know, man, buy your friends a pizza. I mean, I think people know what to do, which is like to be in solidarity in a
Mm,
meaningful way. Um, I think, again, like all of the issues that I've been talking about here, like censorship, like surveillance, disproportionately impact trans and queer folks.
mhm,
I think, and I think just like getting a little bit more expansive, like I've noticed I did a few like Trans Day of Visibility events recently, and it was actually really nice. There was a lot of like older folks there, a lot of like straight cis people that were just sort of like, we want to help. Like, how can we help? Like, this is so terrible. What's happening to all of you? And like one of the main things I said to folks is to just like think a little bit more expansively about what we mean when we say like trans issues.
mhm,
I think people tend to, think specifically about like legal protections, access to gender affirming care, and like that's about it. And like those are really important issues and absolutely are in the crosshairs. But like what I was saying, especially to folks here in Massachusetts, where we actually already have like reasonably good legal protections on the books and folks do have access to the healthcare that they need, like the biggest issue facing trans people in my city is that there's no affordable place to live and you
yeah.
can't get a good job and you're still likely to be harassed on the street by police. And like those are trans issues, right? Like housing is a trans issue. If
Mhm,
my government is taking our tax dollars and engaging in genocide, like that's a trans issue. And so I think just like recognizing that, like, yeah, just like recognizing like trans people are people too, and that are like the issues impacting us are not just kind of like pink, white, and blue rainbow issues or whatever, but like all of the material conditions brought about by capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy. And like we need to be thinking about those things intersectionally rather than sort of like cordoning off like today we're fighting for trans people and tomorrow we're going to fight on Palestine and the day after we're going to fight about prisons. Like all
right.
of these things intersect. And like while each of us needs to kind of pick our lane and not try to do all the things all the time, we do need to understand how the pieces fit together.
Um, there's so many things I would ask you about. Okay, I was wondering if you wanted to talk about your music a little bit. Um, and well, I guess when I was talking about Democrats, I was going to ask you about your Emma Goldman would have beat your ass song. But let's see. I don't know. Like I don't know if you describe your music and how it relates to your politics specifically.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the two have always been sort of inextricably linked for me. Like, in some ways, like when I was in high school, the reason I got involved in stuff is basically like I wrote an anti-war song. It was like one of the first songs I ever wrote. And then I was like, well, I'd be a hypocrite if I went around singing the song and didn't actually try and do anything about this. So I guess I'm gonna like go join that meeting that I heard about and like try and get involved.
Hmm.
Um, that said, I'll say that like the music I make has really evolved over the years. I really did start in that kind of like folk tradition. I was really inspired by folks like Phil Oakes and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger and Woody
Hmm.
Guthrie. My friend Ann Feeney, who was a longtime labor singer and really like a legend of the radical labor movement, was a longtime mentor of mine. She's the person that like convinced me to drop out of college to become a full-time anti-capitalist folk singer for a living. So I guess I can blame her for the rest of the choices that have happened since then. But then more recently, I've obviously am also very inspired by punk and rock and indie rock music. I've taken to like doing a lot of my own recording at home, which has allowed me to like produce like much more layered and complicated music. And I think I've also really, I don't know, maybe it's just my old age talking, but I've come to value the idea of like making music that isn't always just utilitarian. Like I
Hmm.
believe there's like a great role for like a song that you sing on the picket line or a song that is sort of like news headline or like crime think pamphlet set to music or whatever. But I also believe there's like real space for just like writing songs about what it looks like to hold our relationships together while the world burns around us. Music about like doing karaoke with your partner in the basement when we're all locked down because of COVID. And like sharing our personal stories a little bit more too. And the I've been working on a record that'll be out this June. And we just put out one of the songs from it that very much is just like screaming about transphobia. But there's a lot of other songs on it that are sort of more in that personalist political realm that I'm excited to put out there for folks.
Is it bad that your song "Back Row" made me think reinventing Axl Rose, the song?
No, I think that's good. I'll take it.
Oh, but also you were hinting at Spotify's terribleness before, and you have a whole album called "Spotify is Surveillance," which is provocative and perhaps confusing to some people. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And ironically, you can find that album on Spotify because I
Good.
recognize that that's where many people listen to music, and I didn't want it to make it inaccessible to people just to prove a point. But broadly speaking, I called the album that, and we actually launched it alongside a Fight for the Future campaign targeting Spotify over a patent that they had filed to essentially listen to people's conversations and use voice recognition AI software to recommend you music based on your tone of voice, your accent, the language you were speaking, what you were talking about.
Ugh.
Um, that would make things even worse. But the reality is, I think it's important for people to understand that like Spotify has roughly the same business model of Instagram, YouTube, etc. Right?
Mhm.
They collect data about you. They collect data about what music you listen to, and they use that to recommend you more music so that you listen to more things on their platform and they make more money from ads. That is the entire business model. And
Mhm.
I think like with music, and like Liz Pelly is a great journalist who's written a bunch about this. She has a book called Mood Machine that is all about Spotify and its business model. Um, but like she writes about how, there's like real privacy concerns to this, but also just real concerns about like what does this mean for our culture? Where like you have a band that like writes a bunch of songs because they're the songs that they like, and then one of their songs really blows up on Spotify because it like fits into like a certain category that Spotify is really algorithmically pushing. And then suddenly that band decides to write 10 more songs that sound exactly like that just to please the Spotify algorithm because like that's what's paying their bills. And suddenly like humans are making music for like an unthinking, uncaring capitalist robot instead of
Yeah.
for each other. And like what does that mean for like the future of human creativity? If like rather than directly sharing music or art or creativity with each other, it's all mediated by these tech platforms that have their own interests that are completely orthogonal to our interests as like human creatives sharing with each other. So I could go on about Spotify all day. There's also just huge issues with the structure and the way that they pay artists.
Sure.
Um, but for me, I think it's sort of a more fundamental thing of like, what does it mean to have these platforms that have become the intermediaries? In some ways it's like it used to be like big record labels were kind of the gatekeepers or intermediaries, and now it's big tech. And like, I want a world where it's like none of that and we're able to like create things, share them with each other, ensure that all creative workers are like fairly compensated for our labor. And like, but we're a long way between here and there.
Yeah, it's been, the era is so far gone now that I had forgotten about the whole thing where artists would write songs about how much they hate certain record labels and things like that. And I guess, I mean, your version of that perhaps is the Spotify surveillance thing. But a little more substantial than like the Sex Pistols complaining about EMI, I guess. So yeah. um is selling out a thing musically, I
I wrote
guess?
I wrote a whole op-ed about this for Dig Boston, which is like our alternative weekly that folks can go look
Okay.
up. But my argument is that selling out is about like changing what you do in order to like for the purpose of appeasing the mainstream versus, I think like there's been a lot of like discussion of like, or I feel like we tend to like throw people under the bus as soon as they experience any type of like success, right?
Hmm.
And it's like, well, that's actually pretty unhelpful, because what that means is we're going to have a music scene full of like rich kids driving their mom's minivan. If people can't like, make a living making their art, then like, that kind of sucks.
Hmm.
Um, but to me, it's like, if there is such a thing as selling out, it's about like toning down your message to, for the purpose of profit, versus like maybe like thinking about your message and how you can reach the most people with a radical message, right? Or like being a little bit strategic in like what you say or do. I think sometimes we think that those things are selling out, and I don't know. Again, I'm almost 40. Maybe I've sold out, and that's why I think these things. Um, but over time, my thinking on these things has evolved, and I think it's actually profoundly radical to try to like meet people where they're at
Hmm.
and sow the seeds of critical thinking and radical ideas. And, sometimes that doesn't look like screaming, fuck you in their face. Sometimes that looks like telling them a story about something that happened to you or someone else and getting them to think differently about an economic system or a political system or queer experience or whatever. So I don't know. I just have a more expansive view of what it means to be a radical or revolutionary artist in this particular moment in history. And I think the term sellout is thrown around a lot. And I don't know that like mid-sized bands that can sell out a 300 or 500 person venue and like are on a indie record label and like just barely afford to pay their bills every year are sellouts, even though I probably thought that they were when I was like 22.
That's fair. That's a moderate stance, I guess, which I guess that's allowed.
Are you calling me a
Um,
moderate? Wow.
yes,
I'm
centrist. No.
deeply offended.
I wanted to end with a bit of a lightning round. And literally my very first question is Bob Dylan or Phil Oakes. Um,
Phil Oakes.
yeah, I think you hinted at that, and I didn't know you were a fan, but I suspected there was a good chance. And he was excellent. Um, Optimism or pessimism?
Optimism.
Best concert you ever attended?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Recently, I'm very into this Irish band, Fontaines DC. They're like an Irish rock band.
Hmm.
That was the best concert I've attended recently. Best concert ever? I don't even know. Too hard. Too hard.
Um,
Maybe one of the like early Mischief Brew shows that we used to throw in Philadelphia, like way back in the day.
Please note my
Oh, look
shirt
at you! You're wearing a Mr. Crew shirt. Yeah.
in honor of the
Um,
occasion. I fucking loved them, loved him. Alas. Best concert that you ever played?
okay, this would have been at the there was big protests in Scotland ahead of the G8 protests in like 2006, maybe. And me and Ryan Harvey and Mark Gunnery, all from the Riot Folk Collective, were
Hmm.
somehow booked to play on this like little stage at the like anarchist campground where everyone was like organizing with frickin' Oi Polloi and Chumbawamba.
Oh wow, nice.
And it was like totally bonkers. And if I remember, like Oi Polloi were supposed to play, but like the power went out, and so like they put us on after them. So technically, Oi Polloi opened for us. And like no one had ever heard of us or whatever, except for like 10 kids in the front row that were like screaming along to the picket line song. But yeah, I mean, there've been a lot of fun, wild shows over the years, but that was the one that popped to mind when you said that, and it's the lightning round. So there you go.
This might be too much to ask for one, but what your one song of yours that you're most proud of or love the most for some other reason?
Mm. It's not out yet, but I have a
Oh,
song
okay.
on the new record that's sort of about like I mentioned before, like how we hold each other and how we preserve our relationships as the world falls apart around us, that I feel very proud of. And I really am proud of my last record, Spotify Surveillance. It felt like a big leap forward for me musically. And so if you've you know, if you were more familiar with my like early work, which is very like folk punky or whatever, and you're looking for something a little different, I'd encourage folks to check that
um, Least horrible U.S. president,
out. They've all
if
been
there
bad.
is if there is such an animal.
Don't get me started on what Jimmy Carter did in Latin America.
Ooh, a common least toxic choice, and yet there's still, you know, many horrible. All right, worst U.S. president ever. Can you?
I mean, probably like Andrew Jackson, but like in my lifetime, 100% George W. Bush. And this
Oh yeah,
drives me nuts that like people think Trump is worse. And like, I don't know, maybe the second time around he'll end up being worse. But like George W. Bush was like personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians and was like evil, but like significantly more adept at being evil than at least Trump was during his first term. And like the like liberal rehabilitation of George W. Bush is like the thing that has driven me more crazy than almost anything else in recent years. So I'm going to go with George W. Bush.
great choice. Sadly, we'll see about this time around, but I certainly agree about the first time around. Just hard to beat W. One food to bring on a deserted island.
Burrito.
Okay. One song to bring on your deserted island.
Mm. These are really hard. You're like killing me here. Bring one song.
Hopefully, this never comes up in your life because that would be difficult.
Yeah, that would be really difficult. Um, I'm just gonna go with like the song I would bring right now, which is "Not Strong Enough" by Boy Genius.
Okay. Um, Favorite animal?
Anything like small and furry with big ears. My kid and I have pet rats. Rats are awesome pets. I love like a wallaby or like a capybara or like, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Very good. Um, where and when would you stop first if you got access to a time machine?
I cannot say that on the air, I think.
Mm, that's so enigmatic.
I would try to stop bad things from happening.
Yeah, that's I mean the method of time travel is that's a question. But there are a lot of concerts I would attend in my time machine if you wanted to get slightly less um federally interesting, I guess. I don't know.
That's true. That's true. Lots of good stuff.
um And how would I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
Mm. You would go, you would like come out of your like cool, nice kind of like family unit apartment that's like part of the big like squatted social center block and like go downstairs to the coffee collective where they would just like make you a coffee and then like later the people who made you the coffee would come to your cool podcast recording studio to record their podcast and like that would be the exchange essentially.
Fair enough. Um, and I don't. Do you have one, two, or three media recommendations that kind of based on what you've said today? Things about privacy, things about folk punk, that people should check out.
So, whenever people ask me for any type of recommendation, my first recommendation is always the autobiography of Asada Shakur. I think it's like the best and most important radical book that people can read. Um, on the topics that we're talking about today, more, um, Cory Doctorow has a great book called Choke Point Capitalism that kind of builds on top of Surveillance Capitalism, which is another book by Shoshana Zuboff. And I think that's really great. 404 Media, which is where a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the folks that were reporting from Vice went when Vice basically folded, have been doing really great reporting on issues like surveillance and free expression online. So I really recommend all of those resources. Um, I'm surely forgetting all kinds of important stuff, but that's what I got right
Those are good. Yeah. If we had more time, I would pester you about IP and AI and things like that. But
Yes. I'll quickly just say I hate giant corporations dominating AI. I think that copyright maximalism is the worst possible way that we could respond to it, even though I understand why everyone's instinct is to be like, no, like they shouldn't be able to train on copyrighted works. If we go down that path, we're going to end up in roughly the same boat that we're in right now with Spotify, where like a
mhm,
tiny handful of corporations leverage the policing and censorship power of the copyright system to dominate all of AI and will kneecap the possibility of open source or decentralized AI models that could be used for all kinds of things. So, and then I think there's like huge like environmental and privacy and other concerns that we need to be focused on with AI. And frankly, I could care less if like robots are reading the New York Times. I just don't think that that's actually like the most important issue of our time. There you go. That's my lightning round on copyright and AI.
very nice, very nice. All right, well, I can let you go, but you have to tell the good people where on the internet they can find you.
For sure. Good people and maybe some bad people who are listening. My name is Evan Greer. I'm on Blue Sky at Evan Greer. I'm still on Instagram and a few other places. If you just search for my name, I'm pretty easy to find. And my organization is called Fight for the Future, and we have fightforthefuture.org where you can plug in with our campaigns.
You're listening to the Non-Serviam podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. And you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.